All right, so we're looking tonight at Romans 13, 1 through 7. The text is printed on the handout sheet. If you didn't get one, there, it's right there on the stand as you come in. But I would love somebody to read Romans 13, 1 through 7, and we'll begin the study tonight. You want to read it? Yes, sir. All right.
Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who not do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. For he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoers. Therefore it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, who give their full time to governing. Give everyone what you owe him. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor.
All right, so submission to God-ordained authority, specifically submission to government. There might be some juicy aspects of tonight's discussion. There may be some differing views and different thoughts that there may be. That'll be a kind of exciting way to get through our hour. So let me begin with some main questions. Why is this passage so important for us to understand in the Christian life? Why is submission to God-ordained authority such an important part of the Christian life?
It would bring reproach to the church if the Christians were seen as an unlawful body.
Okay, it would be dishonoring to Christ if we were lawless, rebellious, things like that. Dishonor to Christ. Anyone else? Why is this such an important topic and command here?
The Bible's pretty clear about the authority of God in our lives and how he expects us to live. But Christians also desire to have guidance in how we live in this kingdom.
Okay. Yeah, so, God has given us a lot of insights. And as you think about the 66 books of the Bible, you think about the Old Testament, you think about the Jews, you think about governments, the Jewish connection to government, slaves in Egypt, the Exodus, taking over the land from 7 Canaanite nations, defeating them, and then establishing the kingdom, etc. But then, God using Gentile nations to come and punish them from time to time. Ultimately, the exile, the command in Jeremiah to submit to the Babylonian authorities and to seek the prosperity of Babylon while they were in exile, etc. I could go on and on. There's a lot of data on the issue of human government in the Bible. It's not a little, it's a lot. Let me ask the second question. Paul is writing these words, Romans 13, during the days of the oppressive Roman Empire, which was at many times vigorously opposed to the Christian faith and bitterly persecuted Christians. Over 3 centuries from the time of Christ to the time of Constantine, depended on the emperor. Some emperors were more vicious persecutors than others. Some didn't care that much, and Christianity could kind of flourish for a little while, but then the next emperor would come along and crack down. Some of the worst persecutors were right before Constantine in the 300s or so, right before Constantine came. There was a lot of bad persecution. Anyway, that's Paul's context. Furthermore, tradition has it that Paul was executed by the Roman government. He was beheaded as a direct command from Caesar. And it's not like Paul had no idea that that was a direct possibility in his life. All right. Well, given all that, how does understanding that backdrop help put into perspective Paul's commands here to Christians to submit themselves to governing authorities?
I think, if I remember correctly, was Paul possibly executed under Nero?
I think so.
Is that right? So you think of Nero, like anybody knows anything about Roman history, terrible persecutor of Christians, did terrible things. So if Paul would write this under him, you have to think he's saying it's not just when you find the government friendly or palatable under Nero. I mean, that's, wow.
Yeah, it's overwhelming. I mean, he was a maniac. I mean, really an evil man. All right, so the question stands: how does that backdrop give you some perspective on what Paul's writing here? I mean, he's not writing in a sweet, comfortable. What Amanda's saying is he's not unaware of just how bad Nero is in the government. How does that shed light on these verses?
Well, it says in verse 1, "For there is no authority except that which God has established." So even though these vicious emperors are there because God is sovereign and he ordained for them to be in charge.
Okay, yeah, so we're going to walk through that, but yeah, because he sees God behind the government. And rebellion against the government is, in many cases, rebellion against God. Yeah, so it's important to understand that. As you think about different patterns of government, if you know anything about political science, whatever, what are different kinds of governments that there are on earth? I mean, we've got our republic, basically. Say it's a democracy. It's mostly a republic. We vote on leaders who represent us and make laws on our behalf. That's a constitutional republic. That's the United States. What other governments are you aware of on earth?
Dictatorships.
So you got dictatorships, good and bad. It's like, are there any good dictatorships? It's like, all right. What's that?
The Millennial Kingdom.
All right, millennial king. Yeah, Jesus as the good dictator. All right, I would choose king a little bit more. It seems more biblical, but we want to go dictator. All right, so you got dictatorships. What else?
Monarchy.
Got a monarchy, or you got different kinds of monarchies. Constitutional monarchy in England, other forms of monarchy across the ages. What else?
Oligarchy.
Oligarchy. So it's like communism, I guess. It's like rule of a group over everybody else. So yeah, lots of them. All right, which of those is subsumed under this chapter here?
All of them.
Yeah, all of the above. So it doesn't have anything to do with the form of government. It has to do with whatever government is ruling that nation, that state, that country. That's what Paul's writing about here. How would you say this passage goes against the grain of people's fleshly tendencies or sinful tendencies? How does this passage tend to rub people the wrong way? Let's put it that way.
We don't like being told what to do.
We're essentially rebellious. Is that what you're saying? All right. I mean, that's the fact. I mean, when you think about it, like the centurion said to Jesus, "I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me." Right? So I'm kind of in the middle. I take orders and I give orders. But if you think about taking orders and giving orders, you got people above you, you got people below you. There's sin both directions. All right? The tendency of those below you in authority that need to submit to you is tyranny or oppression. That's the sinful tendency there, to take advantage of them and to exploit them with your power. What about those in authority over you? What's the tendency there? The sinful tendency, I would say. To those that are over you and you're under them, what's the sinful tendency as somebody in subjection to somebody over you? How do we sin in those relationships? Rebellion. What else? Like, just think about the average American workplace and you're not the boss. What gets said about the boss behind the boss's back? I mean, I've had secular jobs. I know how they talk. I mean, what do they say about the authority, right? Ridicule, complain. They pick at the person's personality, at the things they say. They mock them, etc. Where is all that coming from? I think it's what Eli's saying. We have a tendency to be rebellious, just simply because they're an authority over us. So we don't like that. As you think ahead to the new heaven, new earth, the eternal state, do you think that there are going to be hierarchies of authority, like created beings over other created beings, or do you see it as a pure egalitarian society in which at last submission to God-ordained authority is gone, except submitting to Jesus? How do you perceive that? do you think you'll have to submit to created beings in heaven?
Is it either the parable of the minas or the talents that they're given cities, right?
Yeah.
So if that's a picture of the future kingdom, then there will be people who are faithful in this life who are given some element of authority in eternal kingdom.
Parable of 5 talents, 2 talents, and 1 talent. One of the most famous reward passages is, well done, good and faithful servant. That's all people know. You hear it at funerals. It's like, yeah, well, there's more in the verse. You've been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. What does that mean? In charge of means you're in authority. It's entrusted to you. I think the simplest way to even understand this is the word archangel, which in Greek means ruler angel. The angels are created beings. They're pure and free from all sin and rebellion, and there is a hierarchy of authority within the angelic realm. We at least know there are archangels and non-archangels. And with arch being ruler, it means ruler angels. So that implies that angels give other angels orders. And given that they're holy angels, they don't have a problem with it. So that gives you a sense that there may well be the same thing happening among the redeemed in heaven, as you said, with the minas and the talents and all that. So I fully expect that what the centurion said will continue for all eternity, which is, I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. So take the word soldiers out and just say people, beings, created, So people. Now, if you're at the absolute bottom of the rung in heaven, just be happy you're there, all right? You'll enjoy your time there, etc. You don't get to boss anyone else. You'll be bossed by other people, but you'll be totally fine with it because you'll have no sin nature, all right? But this does rub us the wrong way because we're so prideful and rebellious, ultimately against God. So how would you say both anarchy and tyranny are wicked or devilish? First, let's take anarchy. What is anarchy?
No law.
Okay, there's no government at all. It's really a misnomer because the one with the biggest gun or the biggest, aggression rules anarchy. Wouldn't you say? It's not like nobody's telling anyone what to do in an anarchistic situation. The criminals are running the streets. Like we see this. It's not like humans just all stay home and everybody behaves themselves when there's no government. It's somebody kind of grabs, and that's like a proto-form of the next government, which is some foreign dictatorship or tyranny. So it's just a transitional state. But how is that devilish or wicked, that sense of like anarchy?
Well, God is a God of order, for one thing. So there should be some degree of order. It reflects his character and his nature.
Yeah. Would you think it'd be terrifying to live in a pure anarchistic country or state?
For example, Haiti right now.
Yeah, Haiti's one of the worst places on earth. And so, yeah, there's been that. There's been anarchy in various African nations in my lifetime, different things. What would make it terrifying? If there were literally no formal government, nothing established, why would that still be a terrifying place to live?
Because the law, there'd be no law, it'd be inconsistent. It'd be based on the whims of one person, which is tyranny too, right?
That's tyranny as
Tyranny,
well.
the person with the biggest gun.
Yeah, so anarchy and tyranny ended up being pretty similar in the end, just because of human nature. But then you've got highly organized states like Nazi Germany, extremely well organized. I mean, to the nth degree. I mean, it'd be hard to imagine a more organized nation than Nazi Germany, but it's still evil. I mean, deeply evil and corrupt. So there's perversion all around in this. How is this passage to be tempered by consideration of the opposite chapter on government, which is Revelation 13? Now, Revelation 13, the dragon, which is Satan, stands by the sea and calls forth the beast from the sea, reminiscent of Daniel 7, in which 4 different beasts come up out of the sea representing human governments. So in Daniel 7, it's a succession of human governments similar to the statue in Daniel 2. And most interpreters take it as the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire. So that's Daniel 7. But in Revelation 13, there's kind of one final beast coming up out of the sea. Revelation 13 seems to point toward the worldwide rule of the Antichrist, John speaks of in 1 John 2. Or Paul speaks of the man of lawlessness, etc. So that's Revelation 13. That's human government at its absolute most demonic. It's overtly ruled by Satan directly through his puppet all over the world. So how do you balance Romans 13, Revelation 13? Romans 13 is submit. You're submitting to God, pay your taxes, do the right things. That's Romans 13. But then Revelation 13, you got an individual who wants to be worshipped as a god, is thoroughly evil, probably Satan-possessed, not just demon-possessed, etc. How do you put those two together? And by the way, if you receive the mark of the beast, you're going to go to hell. So to submit to that government edict will consign you to eternity in hell, so that you're actually commanded to rebel at that point on that issue, whatever that means, whatever the mark of the beast is. During that time, to submit to that and do whatever you're told there is not possible for Christians, because it involves, I'm sure, forsaking your loyalty to Christ and your command, similar to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, something like that. So how do you put that together?
Well, that government in Revelation 13 is also in some sense established by God because it's part of God's sovereign plan, right? And I don't think Romans 13 is submit without qualifications. In the same way that Revelation 13, obviously you can't submit to receiving the mark of the beast.
Okay.
The same way today's government, it's not like we need to do everything it tells to do if they're against God's.
So there's qualifications on all this. They don't submit no matter what. So what would be some of those qualifications? What limitations are there to Romans 13?
And they tell you not to sing in church.
Tell you not to what?
Sing in church.
Sing in church.
It's a real case.
Harkening back to the great year 2020 and the fun times we had then.
I think verse 3 says, "For rulers hold no terror for those who do right." So if you do right, and rulers hold a terror for you, then in some sense they've invalidated their authority in that particular area.
Okay. At the end of this sermon that I preached a number of years ago on Romans 13, I list 6 key ethical questions. I actually ended a sermon with 6 questions. Didn't answer any of them. I don't know how I got away with this. Anyway. All right. Limits to obedience. Is submission to government absolute, or are there limitations? Second question. Limits to opposition. Is organized opposition to government ever permissible? Rebellion, like formal rebellion. Third, capital punishment. Does government have the right to take human life? Fourth, Christians participating in government. How much and in what manner may a Christian participate in government? Fifth question, persecuted Christians. What should Christians do about governments who persecute Christians? And then 6, Christians in war. Should Christians fight for secular governments? If so, won't that lead to the absurdity of 2 spirit-filled Christians killing each other, or seeking to? Each of them led by the Spirit to murder each other, in direct contradiction to 1 John, which you're supposed to love the brothers. So we end up with, all right, so those are 6 questions. Let's close in prayer, all right? So, this is a gnarly issue, let's be honest. And I'm sure you could probably come up with other ethical quandaries that come up with it. So clearly there's a limit. Do you have examples in the Bible of civil disobedience that's celebrated? Are there examples of civil disobedience celebrated in the Bible?
Think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Or who mentioned a few moments ago. Are they celebrated? As you look at them, are they portrayed as righteous, doing the right thing? And yes. Are they in any sense vindicated in the biblical narrative? Clearly. They are vindicated. Yes, Stephanie.
But their manner is very respectful.
Yeah.
They're not obnoxious about it.
They could be, though. I've said before, one of the great moments is when they're in the fiery furnace not dying, and Nebuchadnezzar orders them to come out. And he's like, come in and get us. All right? How about that? Reminds me of that guy that walked the tightrope between the Twin Towers in the 1970s. There's a movie about it I saw recently, a French acrobat that did this. And the police are on each tower waiting for him to come, but they can't do anything to him. You know what I'm saying? So he's like, it's like a picture of Shadrach. It's like, come and get me. We're not, we're telling you to come off the wire. It's like, I'll come off when I'm ready. But he knew as soon as he get off there, he's going to get arrested. But that's different. They were being commanded to do something overtly wicked and evil, which is to bow down and worship an idol. And so they're clearly celebrated and vindicated by God. But, as Stephanie said, they're generally submissive, and obedient. Same thing in Daniel 6, when Daniel continues to pray to God and gets arrested and thrown into the lion's den. He says at the end, I haven't done anything wrong against God or against you, meaning the king, Darius. You know, he said, I've been obedient to you. I've done what I could to serve you and to serve the empire. All right, so, I mean, these are some of the issues that are in front of us. So part of that is the main question. How do we harmonize this passage with the assertion in Acts 4:19 and 5:29, which both teach civil disobedience in the face of immoral law? We must obey God rather than men. You remember that in that context, it's the Jewish authorities that are forbidding the preaching of Christ. They're forbidding the very thing Jesus had told them to do right before he ascended to heaven. You know, stop preaching about Jesus Christ. All right, and they said we can't do that. We must obey God rather than men. So how do you harmonize that?
But if you have to choose,
Right.
you're going to choose to obey God. We can all think of such scenarios like that, right?
Right.
If we're, when you go to countries where you're not supposed to witness, they call it proselytizing.
Mm-hmm.
If we were ever told in America you can't proselytize, we would say, I can't obey that, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, I told a story once, and I got criticized by somebody. It had to do with a visa that I got from the Chinese government in 2001. And they called me, the embassy from D.C. called me before giving me my visa. And they wanted to know what I was doing in China and all that. And the question, I didn't lie, but I didn't tell the whole truth, if you know what I mean. I didn't tell anything untrue. So they issued the visa, but on the visa it said, missionary work not allowed. The problem is they misspelled missionary. So whatever it is that was, I decided I wasn't going to do it, but I was going to do what the Lord had led me to do. And so I told that. It was a Sunday evening service, and somebody was very upset and thought I was violating Romans 13 here. But again, that's a clear example of the Acts 4, Acts 5 thing, where if a government tells you not to preach Christ, I don't think that there's a clear example that we would have in life today of Acts 4 and Acts 5 happening. And you can imagine in Muslim countries, it's illegal to convert. For a native-born Muslim person to become a Christian is punishable, sometimes by death. And so again, that's going to be that situation there. How do you understand this, that all true authority ultimately is from God? How do we understand all true authority is from God? Paul openly says that here. So how do you understand that?
Well, I think about the Great Commission where Jesus said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So he is the one with that authority.
Okay. But then he delegates it to created beings, and that's the point. We all, as Christians, assent to that. The real issue is flawed, sinful, created beings who then have authority, which is every human being who has authority. They're all flawed and sinful, all of them. All parents are flawed and sinful, etc. So all authority comes from God. So I think that actually is a definition, a possible definition of authority, which is the God-given right to command. That would be one simple definition. What do you guys think about that as a definition? That authority is the God-given right to command. Yeah.
Could you also add for the good of the one?
You could add many things, Stephanie. How many things do we want to add to my simple definition?
In our passage that we're looking at, it says he is the servant to do you good.
Right.
I mean, so God-given authority is to serve and protect.
Right. Right. But, and I've thought about this before as a parent, there's a difference between the advice given by a friend and the command given by a parent. It has to do with God-given authority, right? We have the right to command our minor children, etc. What does this passage teach about taxes?
It says pay taxes.
All right, there we go. You should pay them. I said to Ira Curl, who's my accountant, I said, my goal is to pay as much as the government requires and not a penny more. And the not a penny more takes all his skill, so, especially the more complex your financial life is. So, it's complex. The tax code is complex. But the goal is whatever the government says we owe, we should pay. and that's the desire. What about capital punishment? What does this passage say about that? Is it even addressed here?
Bears the sword.
Okay, so there's an implication. He does not bear the sword for nothing, implies.
Not to slap you on the wrist with the sword.
Yeah, capital punishment. All right, so there's lots of discussions about it, though. Some people think it's wrong. How would you argue, based on this passage, that it's biblical? Capital punishment, I mean. Why do some Christians think it's wrong?
Some people will argue that it's unjustly applied. For example, if you have a certain, ethnic group of people that much more likely to get capital punishment, but some people would argue that. I'm not saying that I argue that, but some people would argue that's a reason to not do it at all.
Would you say that capital punishment was unjustly applied in the case of Jesus?
Sure.
Well, there we go. I mean, so clearly it's very likely to be unjustly applied, and we already cited the example of Paul. Do you think it was unjustly applied in the case of Paul and the other martyred apostles? So it's actually very likely to be unjustly applied, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to work to fix the system. For Christians, I think, to come out strongly against capital punishment, you're overturning most of the Mosaic Law. I mean, how many capital punishments are there in the Mosaic Law? Stonings to death, Remember the guy picking up sticks on Sabbath and God told him to kill him? Remember? I mean, they're in the Exodus. They're still in the desert. And the 10 Commandments had come down, and they're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. This guy just went out and picked up firewood the next day, and God, they waited to see what they should do, and God told him, put him to death. And so you can't avoid capital punishment in the Old Testament. I know people work on the epistles and see that, but it's all over the place in the Old Testament.
And the Noahic covenant.
What's that?
In the Noahic covenant. If anyone sheds man's blood, by man's however it goes, by man's hand shall his blood be shed.
Yeah, and the feeling there in Genesis 9 is that that's the way God wants it. It's not just he's making a dark prophecy. He's actually saying that, and it seems to be like before the flood, the implication is that murder was a problem. Remember how it says in Genesis 6 that the thoughts of man's heart was only evil all the time. We have to imagine a lot of that rolled out in murder. So it's just probably it was a bloodbath. And so after the flood, he's reestablishing human society. It's like, murder is going to be dealt with directly by being killed. And so I think you're right. Genesis 9 establishes capital punishment. One thing that bothers me is when people make sociological or other type of arguments saying that it's not an effective deterrent. And I think that biblically it's easy to prove that it is. When you look up the phrase, then all Israel will hear and be afraid, that's tied to capital punishment. When God says, then all Israel will hear and be afraid, he's saying it is an effective deterrent. When you know that that's a possibility, it will restrain evil. Now, on the topic of restraining evil, how does that fit into the purpose of government? Restraining evil. This is not on the sheet here, but it's just something I'm thinking of. How would you see that as one of even the main purposes of lawful government? Restraining evil. Any thoughts on that?
It's protecting the people.
Okay. How does government restrain evil?
By force, by law.
Okay. Let's take traffic laws. That'd be an example of government restraining evil. It's like, what evil would they be? Well, imagine if there literally were no laws. So then you're at was it Judges 21:25? In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Imagine that's the rule of the road. Would you want to drive? Not quite. There's still that line in the middle, and they're still driving on the right and not on the left. I mean, I would say, though, right out here, I would say at least 10 times in the last 5 years, I've seen cars going the wrong way on this road. I don't know what's going on in South Roxborough. Have you seen this?
Coming home Wednesday night, about 3 weeks ago,
I had that same, I might have been on the road at the same time as you.
So,
I was on the phone with Christy. I'm like, wait, what? So I pulled over, and this car is coming right at me. And then they stopped right in the middle of the road as though suddenly enlightenment hit them, and they're like, oh, and they backed up to the next intersection, and then off they went. So I don't necessarily fault them though, because I saw the sign that's give that, that big wrong way thing, and it was bent over and it wasn't easy to be seen. So I feel like they were clearly a stranger to our community and didn't know what they were doing. But at any rate, that was what I saw. I will say this, some of the most terrifying driving I've ever observed in my life was in India. I was in a hotel on the 6th or 7th floor, and I'm looking down on the streets of Pune, India, and I couldn't discern the traffic rules. It reminded me of being like in O'Hare or some other airport where you're generally going to walk on the right and generally going the other way, walk on the left. And that generally was a rule, but it wasn't absolute. And yet I didn't see a single accident. It's like everyone seemed to know how to do it. I think if I drove on that street, it would be less than 2 minutes before I'm in a head-on collision with somebody. But anyway, that seemed to work for them. At any rate, you can imagine the anarchy on the roads. And that's just a simple example of restraining evil. But our law system is overwhelming. I mean, how many laws are there, and how many behaviors and things are regulated and things are prohibited, and there's certain penalties? It's all over the place. And I think behind it, you can see a restraining of evil, the hearts of people's evil being restrained. And that seems to be God's purpose. I think it's similar to the confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel. I mean, what was the reason for that? It made everything harder. But it seems to be a restraining of the spread of evil, the virulent spread of evil. So government does that, it seems to be. In heaven, in the new heaven, new earth, where there will be no evil at all, it seems that there will still be a purpose for government, right? How would we understand that? Where there's no restraining of evil and there's still government, at least the kingship of God. So how would we understand that?
Government does a lot more than just restrain evil.
Okay, that's very good insight. Government does more than restrain evil. So the government of King Jesus, not just in the millennium, but I mean, when there's literally no evil in the hearts of anyone at all, how does that work? It seems to me he has the good ideas first, right? And we follow his good ideas for the new heaven, new earth. Do you think that Jesus will have better ideas than you? Like even when you're in your resurrection body? Yes, you will. All right, clearly. So his omniscience, his perspective, he's the leader, he's making the plan, he's building the new heaven, new earth society, and we follow him. Does that make sense? And then he'll delegate those insights to creative beings who then disseminate. So it isn't just restraining of evil. It's establishing of good. All right, let's walk through the verses and get as far as we can with the time that's left. So those are all main questions. All right, everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. So again, Paul is writing to Roman Christians. So that's the context here. The everyone then here, certainly I think he has in mind all human beings, but he's specifically writing to Christians. He's telling Christians every Christian must submit himself to the governing authorities. All right? So we've already defined authority. What does the word submit mean?
Obey.
Okay. Simply obey. Do what you're commanded to do. Don't do what you're forbidden to do. But there also seems to be a willingness to it, a willing yielding to another. It's not resentful, it's not bitter, it's not churning or whatever. It's just, I'm glad to be under this. I think that's what the word submit. All right. Why is it important for Christians to do it gladly and not reluctantly or under compulsion?
You're ultimately doing it to God if He has ultimate authority.
Yeah, I think that's the best answer. Based on these verses, your submission to the local authorities or the federal authorities, whatever, should be and can be done as an act of worship to God. I think that's a good answer. Any other thoughts on why we should gladly submit to God-ordained authority? All right, in verse 1, the reason Paul gives is what in verse 1? Why should we submit to God-ordained authority?
Can I answer the other question?
Sure.
Well, I think it glorifies God when we submit willingly, because it shows that you're trusting God, that He's going to take care of you, and so.
Yeah, you believe in God ultimately, even if you know that the person you're submitting to is flawed and limited, I think this is Peter's insight in terms of wives submitting to their husbands. It says very clearly to not give way to fear. And the fear is he's going to lead badly. I mean, at least. Could be worse than that. He might be tyrannical in his power. But at least I think it's the thought of every wife that's submitting to a flawed and limited husband that he's going to lead badly or wrongly or not wisely. And so that's that idea. But just in general, the fear is that government will, submission to government will do you harm. It'll be worse for you. Okay? And the reason why, in verse 1, what's the reason Paul gives? Why every Christian, everyone, should submit to governing authorities.
It's been established by God.
Okay. Why would God do that? Think about that. God delegates his authority to creatures, right? And tells other creatures to obey them. Why would he do that?
Well, practical reason is it's generally good for people. Maybe more theoretical reason is it's somewhat a preview of what will exist in heaven.
Okay. All right. I think you could ask a similar question, not exactly the same, but is why does God give Adam and Eve, why does he give them work to do, right, on earth? I mean, he could do it all himself, right? So he gives human beings capabilities, gives them bodies, gives them minds, gives them language, gives them, and then sets them in society with one another. And in that matrix, all kinds of interesting things happen. Authority and submission is part of that in God's wisdom. So that you exercise your own wisdom, you exercise, let's say you're responsible to build the temple like Solomon was or something like that. You got a project to do. You're not going to do it all yourself. And so that involved literally thousands of workers to get that thing built. And so there's a glory in that, in creative beings using their capabilities, their minds, and their relating skills to do work, to do projects. All right, all authorities that exist have been established by God. All right, there's a lot of statements Paul makes in these 7 verses that cause you to scratch your head. All right, there really are. Let me give you an example. All right. For rulers hold no fear for those who do right, but only those who do wrong. Would you call that a head scratcher? If you're doing what's right, you should have no fear at all of governing authorities. Have there ever been people who were doing the right thing and had at least at some level reason to fear from governing authorities? Paul himself, right? Yeah. So what does he mean by saying rulers hold no terror or fear for those who do right, but only for those who do wrong?
They don't have ultimate power. Yes, they can't kill your soul. Maybe.
Right. So at that point, if you're a martyr, it's not going to do you any ultimate harm. I guess that's one way to answer the question. Any other thoughts on these kinds of assertions? There is no authority except that which God has established. These are absolute statements. Or rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Another one that's a bit of a head scratcher. You want to be free from the one in authority, then do what is right, and he will commend you. It's like, really? I'm still waiting for lots of commendations from the state government or the local government. It's like, bring me in to commend me. Boy, you're such a good preacher and teacher of the Word of God. So thankful for what you do. Here's a medal of freedom. So, I mean, it's just, but I believe that Paul is speaking similar to the book of Proverbs here. These are just tendencies and trends rather than absolutely in every case true. That's how I would interpret these statements here. Were you going to say something, Andy?
Well, so could it be similar to when Peter says, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. Before that, he says, let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a meddler.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Like, could that be similar
Yeah.
to what Paul is saying in that, okay, you don't have to fear, because ultimately God has all authority. There are consequences when we sin, but those moments when, no, we didn't sin, then you don't have to worry about whatever you face.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. What do you think about the ebbs and flows of history and how a particular set of people gets to be in charge of a certain patch of ground, right? Like take, for example, World War II, 1940, let's say, the Nazi occupation of Holland, all right? Are they the God-ordained authority over the Dutch in May of 1940? How do we understand that? So that all Dutch people should submit to the Nazi rule. Would it have been wicked to be part of the Dutch resistance at that point?
No, because the Nazis were the usurpers, I would say at that point.
I would say too, we're in agreement. But here's Romans 13. I'm saying there's questions here, isn't there? I mean, how do you know, like, at what point do you accept it, whatever? Because we know the Romans, they're in charge because their legions beat everybody else's troops, and now they're in charge, right? They won the battles on the field. And now they're the ones that you have to submit to. Any thoughts on this?
About in the colonies, when the 1770s, we rebelled against Britain.
Some people did. I guess I wasn't alive at the time. I'm kidding. So that's a lot of Christians. There were pastors that led the way on these things. As a matter of fact, you could argue that some of the strongest revolutionary leaders were preachers. But there's a lot of history there between the colonies and the British government, and there's a sense in which there was a governmental pact that was broken, the taxation without representation. That was basically that the government, King George III and all that, was breaking the rules. So we could get into those things, but I'm definitely saying historically, lots of pastors, New England Puritan pastors, led the way in their preaching toward rebellion against the British government. And they knew this Romans 13 passage very well. So it's
where the moral obligation and those qualifications come into play, because the Nazis were definitely not following God's qualifications for leaders.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things that'll just scramble your noodle on this. When the Nazis invaded Soviet Russia, like, who are we rooting for? I mean, the Ukrainians were thinking the Nazis were liberators because of how evil the Soviet government was. They hated the Soviet Union. As we see now going on, the Ukrainians did not think of themselves as part of the Russian Empire. So it's just like, it's an interesting chapter here. But I think what we get big picture is Jesus is not wanting his subjects to be thinking about secular government and toppling the Romans. That's not their work. Their work is to submit to their masters if they're slaves, to submit to their husbands if they're wives, to submit to their parents if they're and fit in and do the work of the kingdom. They're not trying to overturn the apple cart. Like, have you guys seen the movie Spartacus? All right, so this is one of the great movies from the early 60s. Stanley Kubrick, all right? Kirk Douglas and all that. Anyway, so it's a movie about a true story, which is a slave revolt about 100 years before Jesus, led by a slave named Spartacus that was incredibly successful. Got to 180,000 slaves on the Italian boot. So much so that Rome had to call back 3 legions from distant lands to deal with it. All right? Well, what do you think happened when they called the legions back from the distant lands to deal with it? Do you have any sense of how that went for the slaves?
They got crucified.
Yeah, 6,000.
Line them up as they could down.
Yes, 6,000 crosses. I watched Spartacus with my daughter Daphne a couple years ago, and she was really angry at me at the end of the movie because it had no happy ending. It's like, Dad, so what was this? Why are we watching this? As he's, everybody got crushed. But this is Rome. Rome had another, 1,000 years to go. So they were not going to get beaten. So meanwhile, Jesus in John 18 standing before Pontius Pilate, and Pilate asks him, so you're a king, huh? It's like, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would what? Fight. But it is as it is, my kingdom is from another place. It's of another type. I'm not telling my servants to fight. It's not what we're doing. We're submitting to the Romans. And we're trying to win them to Christ. And they were amazingly successful at doing that in 3 centuries. I mean, remarkably successful. So it's a whole different approach to Rome that Jesus has taken from Spartacus. They're just taking a whole different approach. He's not sending his converts in battle against the Roman legions. He's telling them to submit to Rome and to do the work of the kingdom, to pray, to be godly, to, manage their own households, to not be dependent on other people, to work hard with their own hands, preach the gospel, live godly lives. That's what he's telling them to do. So anyway, see where we're at here.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Going back to the very first verse, we find something might be beneficial. I'm not asking you to do this, but like defining like governing authorities.
Okay.
Like the colonial example would be like some of those New England pastors would say, the colonial Massachusetts legislature is our government.
Right.
And so we're not violating Romans 13. We're not rising up against our government. We're actually obeying our government against a foreign government. Or the same thing like the Dutch resistance.
Yeah.
The Nazis are not our governing authorities. The Dutch government, which may be in exile or whatever, we recognize our authority.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I don't know a lot of British, English, British governmental history. I think there's a lot of story with the Scottish Covenanters, with the Magna Carta, with all that. And these are Englishmen. They saw themselves that way before the Revolution. They were. And, when they're doing the no taxation without representation, I think they're calling them on flaws, on errors that they're doing. So, but it's aside from that situation, it's hard to know, what is the governing authority? I think in general, you just see providentially who wins and who runs the country and who rules. The general Christian population their job isn't to take up arms and try to topple that. It's like submit and fit into it and do the things I just described. Do your families, do your work, do your farming, whatever, and preach the gospel. I think that seemed to be what he's saying here. I'm not sending a bunch of Christians to be insurrectionists. Well, is rebellion, is insurrection, all that ever justified? You're being crushed by tyranny, and you organize with other people and throw off the tyrannical yoke. How do we say yes? No. I mean, we're reading this passage, but how would we argue that it is justified?
I think for Christians, it's justified when the line being crossed deals with our obedience to God, not tyranny, like maybe economic tyranny or something along those lines.
Right. Yeah, I mean, these are hard questions. I don't have all the answers on all those things, but that's the thing that Christians have had to decide throughout history. So fundamentally, though, God, what Paul's saying here in Romans 13, God has established human beings to rule, and if you are rebelling against that, you're rebelling against what God has instituted. And he says, therefore, you shouldn't do it, because if you do, you're going to bring judgment on yourself. That's one reason you shouldn't do it. What does that mean?
You'll be punished.
Who's going to punish you?
Government.
The government will. And there's an implication possibly you might bring God's judgment on yourself too. For me, I think it's a simplistic way of understanding all who draw the sword will die by the sword. All right? You remember how Peter wanted to fight for Jesus? Remember he drew his little fisherman's machaira there that he used to cut up fish? So he pulls out the sword to take on probably, the way I read it, maybe as many as 600 Roman soldiers. So if we just take it as simple advice given from Jesus to Peter when he said, put your sword away, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword, he's giving him an immediate prophecy if he doesn't put the sword away. What would that prophecy be? What's likely to happen to Peter within 8 seconds? I mean, he's going to get mowed down. And all humor aside, that would happen in general to the Christian slaves and the Christian folks that decide to take on Rome. You see what I'm saying? They're going to get slaughtered. They're going to just die, and not for what Christ would want them to. He wants them to die for the kingdom as martyrs, preaching the gospel. I mean, not that everyone would be a martyr, not throwing off the Roman yoke. So, at any rate, rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. We've already talked about this, but how is that true? A scenario, right? You're driving along the road. It's evening, it's night, and you see up ahead a bunch of blue kind of flashing lights, and then a barrier, and then there's a roadblock, and they're searching cars. Okay? All right. 2 scenarios. One is you're a spirit-filled Christian, everything in your cars, there's nothing weird or whatever going on, or you're a cocaine drug runner, all right? You would approach those blockades with probably different physiological things going on inside your body, right? Your adrenaline and your heart rate, right? So that's a practical way of understanding this. If you're not doing anything wrong, you don't have any fear of them looking in your trunk. Does that make sense? I think that's what Paul's generally saying. If you're just a law-abiding citizen, you don't have anything to fear in general from government. But if you are drug running or something like that, you have something to fear. I mean, you probably have all had those moments, right? Like with the TSA, where they swab your hands, right? That's happened to me recently. They're swabbing your hands. They're swabbing your laptop. I have no fear except of missing my flight. I know that, but I usually leave enough time for that. So why are they doing that? See if there's any drugs. But I have literally no fear in that. Yeah.
To what extent does Satan, like, kind of, is he involved in government? Because isn't he like the ruler of the age and...
He's involved in all of them. Didn't he say that to Jesus?
Yeah.
He showed him in an instant what? All the kingdoms of the world and their glory. All of them. And he said, all of it has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want. What does that tell you? Jesus didn't argue with him either. It says the whole world lies under the power of the evil one. Isn't that in 1 John? Whole world. And then you got the prince of Persia, right, in Daniel. Those territorial spirits. I just look on it as governmental spirits. Demons are all over the place, you know. So I would say the exception would be a government that overtly, clearly lives for the glory of Jesus Christ and the spread of his gospel. And all of those laws and all of the officials in it, their top priority is the glory of God through Jesus Christ and the spread of the gospel. So which government would you say that is on earth?
We don't have a government like that.
There's not a single one. So what that means is Satan's involved in all of the other ones. Every non-Christian, every high, middle, or low-level official, Satan's involved. Demons are involved. They are. But yet God is ruling. He's reigning. He's directing the king's heart like a watercourse. He's ruling. So I would say it's all over. I think there's the issue of like Babylon, for example, right? Remember how Peter said in 1 Peter 5, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings. He's talking about Rome. So why does he call Rome Babylon? What does that mean? In what sense is Rome Babylon for Peter?
It's another empire that's going to rise and fall.
So I look on Babylon as a transferable spirit that then rests and is Babylon there for a while, and then it moves, and then it's here, right? So would you think a contestant for Babylon would be whatever nation on earth is the most militarily powerful and the most economically powerful? We would probably see Babylon there, unless they're living openly for the glory of God. So what nation would that be?
America.
And it's like, is America Babylon? It's like, look, are there Christians in government? Was Daniel in Babylon? He was literally in Babylon, all right? I'm not saying every single government official is living for the wickedness, but I'm saying the system. Is the system for the glory of God? And that's the whole thing. Now, our government I think our government's amazing. Like the separation of powers. You can see Christian fingerprints all over the thing. I think it's marvelous, and it's been remarkably resistant to wickedness. But you can't imagine that Satan's like working all over the world, but he's leaving Washington, D.C. alone, or Raleigh, North Carolina alone. I don't think we would see that. So we have to imagine that he is. And I believe in heaven, when we look back in retrospect, we're going to see how involved demons and Satan were at key moments throughout history. And yet God's kingdom kept advancing. I find that encouraging. All right, let's see. We've got about 4 more minutes. Let's see if we can walk through it and we'll be done. What does it mean when it says he is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer, or he is God's servant to do you good? The phrase God's servant. Government officials are God's servants. How do we understand that?
If he put them in power, They're working for him.
Whether they know it or not?
Yeah.
Would you guys agree that they're God's servants whether they acknowledge him or not?
They could be disobedient servants. I think they're under his authority, but they could be not properly executing his authority.
Yeah, and I quote in my question Q&A sheet here on question 15, Isaiah 45:4, talking about Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great was a pagan world emperor, right? And what Isaiah says there, God says to him, "For the sake of Jacob my servant, I summon you by name and bestow on you a title of honor, though you do not acknowledge me." Do you see that? I'm giving you an empire, though you do not acknowledge me. And so we have to see that God does that, and he establishes people in these positions of authority, even though they don't love him or acknowledge him at all. So, and to me, that's encouraging. What I also find encouraging is Proverbs 21:1, which I quoted a moment ago, and that is, the king's heart is like a watercourse in the hands of the Lord. He directs it whatever way he pleases. What does that mean to you? We've already acknowledged demonic influence over human, not Christians, but over human government officials. But what is Proverbs 21:1 teaching us? The king's heart is like a watercourse in the hands of the Lord. He directs it whatever way he pleases. What do you learn from that?
God's sovereign over it all. That whatever happens in the world is according to his plan. And I mean, if he wants the king to do something, it's going to happen. You think of like Caesar Augustus issuing a decree so that Joseph will take his wife down to Bethlehem to...
Yeah. Or, as I preached recently, Pontius Pilate decided to give the body to Joseph of Arimathea, right? Would you say that's an example of the king's heart, the governor's heart, being in the hand of God? That was essential to God's plan. And he had, in one sense, no choice but to do that. He's not going to say, nope, I'm going to decapitate him, burn him, and put him in a common grave. It's like, no, none of that's happening. So the Lord was sovereign over that. And I think he's used that over 20 centuries to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth, despite the fact that many of these government officials didn't want the gospel at all and would have fought against it and were opposing it. Still it spread. And I find that encouraging, comforting. All right, any final thoughts about this topic, since we've solved all governmental questions tonight and walked through all these things? Any final insights? Okay.
Are there spheres where you say the government... So some people say, obey the government as long as they don't tell you to sin. But then, do you see it as there are spheres where the government doesn't have the authority to step in and tell you to do something, even if it wouldn't be sin? So for instance, let's say the government said, wear beanies on your head when you go to Costco or something. Like, that's a requirement. Is that within the government's role to... Maybe that's a silly example.
Well, I mean, for me, as my wife and I, with our kids, we were home educators. But we were standing on the shoulders of other people who fought in the courts to have the right to educate their children at home and not send them to the government schools. All right, but before that happened, it was illegal, and it is illegal in many European countries and other places that home educating is illegal. I would consider that a government overreach. That they're going into the actual home between a mom and dad and their kids and saying, and the Nazis openly said, your children are ours. We'll do whatever we want with them. They openly said that. And so I would consider that an example of government overreach. So it's a good question. Andy, would you mind closing in prayer, please?
Father, we thank you for the government. We thank you for the gift that you've given us. We just pray for wisdom to know when and how best to honor government when we can. And then, like as Peter said, as far as we're concerned, we have to obey God rather than man. And so I just pray that we'd be willing to obey you at all costs. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.